Okay, here we are. And I think you can see the problem. More mud than room. Now, we don't really use this space very much, well, except to store garbage that we will never throw out, which is a shame because we have a door to the outside here that the kids could be using to come and go instead of tracking mud through the entire house like they currently do. So we're going to turn this mess around, reclaim it, and build a proper mudroom. So I'm going to redo the entire mudroom with benches and lockers and shelves and hooks and storage and pole vaulting, maybe some skydiving, all the things you see on TV. But first, we're going to start with the laundry. Now here you can see we have the washing machine just kicking around out in the open. The dryer doesn't exist because we're in Germany. We have a terrible, pretty much useless basement sink here that I have to replace. Not even storage up here. This is just a complete mess of a shelf that was kind of thrown together. We're gonna fix all of that. We're gonna start with cabinets, both a lower cabinet and an upper cabinet. So we're gonna have a lower cabinet right across here with a brand new sink. We're gonna have it extend right across to the wall over top to give a nice area for folding the laundry. The upper cabinets will cover this entire area with LED lighting underneath, and we're gonna move these outlets to hide them and make them a little bit more accessible. Step one, I have to order some plywood. Just got the plywood dropped off, ready to start the project. Now, one of the biggest challenges of having a small shop in your basement is getting full sheets of 3/4 inch plywood down the stairs and around the corner. That means everything needs to be broken down out here in the carport. Fortunately, today, nice bright sunny day, no better time to do it. Let's make hay while the sun shines. I break my plywood down with the track saw. You could do it with a simple circular saw and a straight edge, but I highly recommend getting a proper track saw, or Tauchsäge auf Deutsch. Truly worth the extra money. I've seen a number of different methods for supporting the wood, but I have zero issue getting down on the ground. The key is to have a sacrificial sheet to lay the plywood on. I'd like to use foam insulation, but I just don't happen to have any. I do have this press board that lives in my carport though. It's fine. Plywood used to be expensive. Now it's downright off the charts. I can't really afford to waste even a little bit of it, so I try to plan my cuts carefully. I use a very sophisticated technology involving a pencil and whatever scrap paper happens to be lying around. Using my treasure map, I make very careful measurements and double check them. Being able to set the depth of the Tauchsäge is a great feature. Make sure to check the depth while it's on the track, as it will add a couple of mils. I want to make sure it cuts all the way through, but not much deeper than that. Lining up the track exactly where it needs to be takes a little practice. If I'm not quite certain, I'll add an extra blade width. Ideally, for long cuts like this, I'd have an extension track, but who am I, the King of England? We're going to clean this up on the table saw later anyway. Here's something I do approximately never. Normally, when cutting out your pieces, you'd run the entire length of the plywood, or you risk wasting more than you save. But in this case, I know I'm going to need some long, thin pieces later on to act as stretchers. And we have all of the pieces knocked out. Good thing too, because tomorrow's Sunday and we're in Germany. Oh, FYI, the kid can rake. All the plywood has been broken down to size, ready to be finalized on the table saw. But first, quick look around. This place is a mess. We got tools everywhere, dust covering everything. I make most of my mistakes in a messy shop. So first off, I'm gonna clean this up. While I was tidying up the shop, I noticed that the blade on my table saw was really quite dirty. I've been cutting pine. Your situation, for you, will be much improved if you have a clean, sharp blade. Now this one is probably sharp enough, or I'm too lazy to send it in to be sharpened, but it definitely needs a good cleaning, and that's pretty simple to do. Step one is make sure you don't drop the nut down the hole like From there, I just use some warm water, laundry soap, and my wife's toothbrush. Then a quick rinse with some clean water and dry with a paper towel. Well, that's better. Now, as accurate as the track saw is at individual cuts, we want each piece of the cabinet to be the identical width. So we're going to use the table saw for that. I purposely left each piece a little bit wide so that we can clean up one edge and then flip it around and cut each piece to size. That way they're going to be identical and they're going to line up just right. When cleaning up the edge, I picked the smallest piece out of the group and set the fence to remove just a sliver. Then run the rest of the pieces through. After each piece goes through, I like to mark the side that still needs to be cut. With all the pieces cleaned up, we set the final width. Let's be extra safe. Set the fence to the proper width based on the inside tooth. In this case, it's not tremendously important if we are dead on. Rather, we need to make sure all the pieces are identical. So we cut all the pieces for the lower first, and then reset and cut all the pieces for the upper. Widths are all cut on the upper and the lower cabinets. Now we got to cut for the proper length. I left a little bit extra when I was breaking this down outside so we could cut it up exactly to length. I'm fortunate with the upper cabinets being only 30 centimeters deep that I can cut them to length on the Kepsäge or compound miter saw. Now ideally I would have a complete station set up with stop blocks and everything built right in, but I don't have the space for that, as you can see. So what I did when I made the stand for the miter saw and the workbench is I made them so that they are exactly the same height. So that when I do want to set up stop blocks, I can clamp a makeshift one to the workbench and still get repeatable cuts. Not nearly as good as an actual station, but it's going to get the job done. The real challenge is going to come when I'm cutting the lower cabinets to length, because at 55 centimeters, they're much too large for this to handle, so I'm going to have to come up with a better solution. Meanwhile, let's get to work on this. A similar process as cutting the widths. First, we square off one side of all the pieces. We've got all the side pieces of the upper cabinet squared off now, and now we want to cut them to length. It's important that we cut all 4 upright pieces the same length, 60 centimeters, and all 4 cross pieces the exact same length. So to do that, we're going to use a modified stop block method with the Kepsäge or compound miter saw. The front 2 legs have no wheels, the back have lockable wheels, so I can move it around fairly easy, but lock it into place if I need to. In this case, we're going to use a bunch of our scrap pieces from our offcuts to dial it in to the exact distance that we want for each cut. Once we get it to 60 centimeters, we'll just leave it and cut all 4 pieces. With our scrap piece in place, we clamp down our 2x4. The resulting stop block will allow us to repeat our cuts, ensuring that all of our pieces are identical. Upper cabinet pieces cut to size. That was the easy part. As you can see here with the lower cabinet pieces, much too wide for the Kepsäge, the compound miter saw. So I would be comfortable cutting these on the table saw in this direction. However, my table saw is just not big enough. And the large piece, the bottom piece, way too dangerous. I would never want to cut that. Even if I could, I would never cut it something so long and so narrow as a rip instead of a cross cut. If something gets twisted, you're in some trouble. So the table saw is out. One option I have is to get out the track saw, which isn't terrible for the bottom piece of the lower cabinet. The upper cabinet is a fixed size. It has to go from wall to wall with no wiggle room at all. The lower cabinet, I'm going from the washing machine to the wall, so if there's an extra little couple millimeters between that gap, it's not the end of the world. So I can get a pretty decent 90, and it's a one-off cut. I can then match the stretchers to the bottom later on quite easily. So that would work fine for that. However, when it comes to the side pieces, I think my best bet might be to use the miter saw and make 2 different cuts. Let's give that a try. Okay, change of plans. I'm going to square off one end of these pieces with the track saw first, and then cut them to size on the miter saw. I'm not confident I'm going to get solid 90s on these large side pieces using the miter saw, especially if I have to cut them twice. So my new plan is I got them lined up evenly here on the bench. I have them clamped down, and I'm going to use the track saw set to double depth and cut both at once. Once I got 90, I'll flip it around, cut the other side, clamp down again, so they'll both be exactly the same size. Now, they might both be crooked the equal amount, but that's okay. Like the guys I used to work with back at the city would say, hey, we're not building a piano here, which we're not, but I'd still like it to be straight. Measure very carefully in multiple spots to make sure I haven't made a mistake. Then I double check for square. With all the pieces cut, we have to add a 1/4 inch dado to accept the backing. But before we can do that, we need to cut some stretchers. 8 of them. You'll remember that's why I was very careful to leave an extra long piece when I was breaking down the plywood, so we had enough material to cut all 8 stretchers. Now 7 of those are completely arbitrary. They just need to be the length of the cabinet. But one of those has to have the same 1/4 inch dado in it as the rest of the box. So we're going to cut those now. Can I get 2 long stretchers from one piece? Nope. Once you've cut them to length, we set up the table saw for the dados. They're going to be inset the depth of the stretchers, so we use a scrap piece to set the fence. Next, we set the depth of the cut. This you can eyeball. Halfway-ish? I'd use a dado stack for this, but they are verboten in Germany. Tut mir leid. Multiple passes with a regular blade works just fine. I always use a piece of scrap for a test. Blam! We want to run all the pieces that will receive a dado through before we move the fence. I always start with the piece that would cause me the least headache to redo if I make a mistake. In this case, it's the 1 stretcher. Once the first cut has been made on all the pieces, we nudge the fence away from the blade slightly to make the next cut. Remember, we're cutting into the piece. Keep doing this until you have a nice fit with the 1/4 inch plywood. With all of our pieces prepped, now comes the fun part, actually building some boxes. So that means we're going to cut a series of intricate Japanese dovetails in our entire project or just use pocket holes. Now, why do I love pocket holes so much? Because I'm not a pretentious. They're simple, secure, and invisible if done correctly. But the best part is they're fast, which means I can complete this project and move on to the rest of my house. Wait a second. I'm going to be screwing the 2 upper cabinets into the wall so they're nice and secure, obviously. But I'm going to be doing that by myself. How do I anticipate holding them not only in the proper position, but perfectly aligned while I make that happen? What if I take one of the back stretchers in each of them, cut a 45, which can then act as a temporary French cleat, holding everything in place while I finish the proper mounting? Yeah, I know. As much as I love French cleats and build them into every project that I can, I hate cutting the 45s. The physics makes it more dangerous than I would like. The angle of the blade causes outward force on the back of the piece, and it can shift if you're not very careful. I always use the riving knife, or splitter, and a homemade push grip that ends up getting a little banged up. I also keep my fingers out of the handle in case there is kickback. I'd prefer the piece fly off by itself without my fingers being tangled up in it. The basic structure of the cabinet has the top and bottom going into the sides. This way, there will be no ugly seams on the outsides of the cabinets. If we drill the pocket holes on the inside, not only will we see them, the joints will be a little bit weaker. We want to drill them on the top and the bottom so they're hidden against the ceiling and the floor. On a project like this, with multiple pieces and pocket holes going everywhere, it's easy to forget one. Or even worse, drill some that you don't need. So it's a good idea to go through ahead of time and mark all the holes that you're going to drill. I usually drill each hole in 2 or 3 stages just to let the sawdust escape. For the larger pieces, simply clamp the jig directly in place. I've been using pocket holes on a variety of projects for a little over a year now, but for some reason have avoided buying a corner clamp, and I don't really know why. Did I think they were overrated? Maybe. Did I think I was better than I actually am? Probably. And for the most part, I was getting reasonably straight joints without it. But now that I'm going to be building cabinets and a new kitchen, I figured it's time to ditch the horseshoes and hand grenades approach and go for something a lot more accurate. Now, you can get by with just pocket screws, but I like to use glue as well. For the larger cabinet, I just assemble it right on the floor. Hey, did you ever see that movie, The Godfather? Before we cut the 1/4-inch plywood backings to fit, we want to add a little stability to our lower cabinet. Now, our upper cabinets are going to be 4 solid pieces, so we'll handle that later. But here is where our stretchers come in. We cut 4 stretchers for the lower cabinet. One of them has the slot, and that's going to fit here. That's going to be the last one we do. So now we want to add one of these across the front of the top to add some support until we get to the next step. The front stretcher sits flush, so it's easy to pop on. The location of the top back stretcher will depend on the stretcher with the dado. The front one alone will give us enough strength to make sure that we don't accidentally damage our cabinet. Looks like we got ourselves a convoy. Time to cut the backs. Now for the lower cabinet, that's going to be pretty straightforward, but with the upper cabinets, I'm going to set the bottom, this is the bottom even though it's on top, I'm going to set the bottom down or up 12 to 15 mils so that I can hide the LED underlighting that we're going to install. Now that means we're going to have to accommodate for that when we measure. So the basic move here is we're going to measure inside to inside, and then we're going to add a little bit extra for the dado. Or if you want to be precise here, you can pop a scrap piece into the dado, draw a line, and measure that. Try and make the back square, but since all 4 sides will eventually be hidden, it's not the most critical measurement of the whole project. Once it's cut to width, we measure for the height. I clamp on a spacer and use a scrap piece to check the bottom. Make sure to factor in the dado to that measurement. Backs are cut. Now it's time to install the bottoms. Not only do I want them to be identical on either side of the cabinet, I want both cabinets to be identical so that when they are screwed together, they will behave as if they are one solid unit. In order to do that, I've cut a couple of spacers, one for the top to make sure we're flush here, and the other, a large piece of scrap plywood that will keep it exactly where I need it to be and is repeatable 4 times. Now normally I would cut 2 identical spacers for this, one for each side, but remember how expensive plywood is? I happen to have one piece that was pretty much the right size already and didn't feel like ruining another piece. I was able to clamp one side relatively close while I screwed in the first side using the spacer and then simply moved the spacer over for the second part. With the bottoms in place, we can add the stretchers to the back of the upper cabinets. Remember, the top stretcher is the one with the 45, so we can use the French cleat later. These will add strength, but also give us something solid to use to attach them to the wall. Once the back of the lower cabinet is cut to size, we want to lock it down using the stretcher. You'll remember we cut one with a dado, and that's going to fit right on here. With that in place, we add the back stretchers just like the upper cabinets. Then, to make sure everything is strong, I screw the stretchers together. I saw Jason Hibbs over at Bourbon Moth do that, so if your cabinet is too strong, blame him. Stage 1 complete. We have cabinet carcasses, which means we're almost done the project. Not even close. Next step, I'm going to go pull everything out of the mudroom and get that area prepped so I can install these once they're painted. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for part 2.